All right. Just as a reminder, paper is due on Monday. Then we've got Thanksgiving break, and then the following Monday will be our review day, which will be the last day of classes. So keep that in mind. And then that Wednesday will be our final. So that's that. And for the online folks, I'll put the uh, final up probably on that Tuesday, so you'll have the full week to do it, because I have to have the grades in by the next Tuesday. Okay, so, um, any questions from you guys about any of that before we jump into stuff? Everybody good? Okay, so, that is the wrong thing. Okay, so this is where we ended off last time, because I just really wanted to get to that. The, grab May turtle. So with the French Revolution and Napoleon really happening in France, there was lots of issues with the French and English, um, resulting in various embargoes, and which in turn hurt the American economy just like to a great degree. Which, as we'll see here, next chapter here just a little bit, it caused a lot of issues besides just people weren't happy with the embargoes. Okay. Again, I kind of got more on here than I meant to. So this is U.S. population grows and migrates. Got an email? Oh, yes, YouTube. So by 1820, we had a quarter of non-Native Americans, so, just Europeans, I guess, living west of the Appalachians, which was pretty substantial considering, like, up until this point, the frontier has been just the western parts of the East Coast states. But following the war, um, we started pushing beyond the Appalachians, and I mean, we also have the Louisiana Purchase going on. Um, and so it's no longer the Mississippi River as the boundary, it's well beyond that. So while we still have a majority of Americans living out in rural areas, out in the countryside, we started to really see the growth of cities in America. We had New York and Philadelphia, had about 100,000 residents in 1810. Immigrants like the Irish were a vast minority of these populations, and when we get to next semester, once we get to about 1900, immigrants in general are like 75% of the populations of most of these big cities, which is pretty interesting. Also, cities on the frontier, so we had New Orleans, which has been around, basically forever as far as America is concerned. And then also Cincinnati, which grew up with the move west, encouraged more people to head west because, well, we had cities there now. So you didn't have to, once you crossed the Appalachians, you were just in the wilderness and you had to make it on your own. You could head west and just go to another city. Now, granted, these were still kind of frontier towns, but they were becoming major cities. So you could just go there and live a city life. Or what often would happen too is people that were going to be going like for the frontier would head across the Appalachians, make their way through the Ohio River Valley, and then stop in one of these cities to resupply, recuperate if they had any issues traveling across um, what is, the modern day Midwest. And then they would continue from there into what was the real frontier now. So yeah, these cities really encourage people to make their way out. Obviously, this caused lots of issues. The Native Americans that were there to begin with, but also the ones that we were pushing west, were like, okay, well, you pushed us this way, now you want to take our land again. That's not great. Um, the French and Spanish that were still there, and I mean the Spanish also had all the territory, Texas and west, um, and of course as soon as we get anywhere near them, we start pushing over the line because it's America. Um, so there's conflict among these groups. But the main thing we're going to talk about here is the roads, or lack thereof. We had to build roads and turnpikes to really allow this kind of movement because, again, before this, roads were basically just clearings through the woods. Um, it mentions here before the Lancaster Turnpike, it costs the same to move wheat 62 miles overland to Philadelphia as it did to ship that same amount of wheat um, from Philadelphia all the way to London over the Atlantic Ocean, because it was just very tedious, very dangerous to move stuff overland, not just because of, the natives we had pissed off and were more than happy to attack convoys, but just like there could be a flash flood or an avalanche or God knows what, and you lose your shipment. Whereas on the ocean, sure, there's still plenty of things that could happen, but we've been back and forth over the Atlantic for the last couple of hundred years now. We've gotten pretty good at it. So we've got Albert Gallatin again. I told you guys he would be important. He was Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury. He brought Jefferson to work on these internal improvements, roads, canals, etc. We'll get more into more specifics with that next chapter. We'll talk about a few things here. The National Road made its way through Maryland, western Pennsylvania into Western Virginia. West Virginia wasn't a thing yet. That didn't become a thing until the Civil War. It's also called the Cumberland Road. Made its way to Ohio and Illinois. So this was kind of, sort of, it was by definition an interstate. It was traveling through multiple states. Also, we had Robert Fulton. He brought together a lot of technology of the day. Oliver Engine steam engine, worked with Robert Livingston, who just had a ton of money, and created the first successful steamboat, the Clermont. I just want to, because I feel like I did a paper on the Clermont, or at least Robert Fulton. There's a lot of qualifiers here. So the steam engine had been around for a couple of hundred years at this point, but it wasn't. When I say steam engine, I don't mean like locomotive train. I mean like it's an engine that uses steam to make power, and that was typically to just like pump water out of mines. Pretty inefficient. It was typically used to pump water out of coal mines because then you could just pick the coal up off the ground and throw it in the machine to keep it running. As far as putting it on something to make the thing move, it wasn't real effective because they were so sensitive to being jostled. But Oliver Evans had a more effective steam engine, and Robert Fulton is the one that put it on a boat. Now there were other steamboat designs that were not very efficient, and it was too expensive to run them, basically. But the Clermont was what finally was powerful enough, light enough, and cheap enough, despite again him having to go to Paris to like get some rich dude to help him out, to actually be used in commerce. So that's what the Claremont wasn't this thing that came out of nowhere. This is like, oh, how about we put a steam engine on a boat and make the paddles turn? That had been done before, but it just had never been done well. So that's what we have with the Claremont. And the reason why this is such a big deal is that steamboats can move stuff upriver. Because again, as I told you guys, with how shipping had been done before, you'd be upriver and you'd have whatever crops, because again, it's going to be, you're a farmer. You build a barge out of whatever trees are nearby, because again, typically you're in a forested area. You build your little barge, you put all your stuff on the barge, you either like put some kind of emblem or symbol or letter on the barge to tell the people that get it whose farm it came from, or you just have a dude on the barge to make sure it doesn't get stuck on the way down. Send it downriver, get to the seaport at the end of the river, because most rivers had a seaport at the end. You sell all your stuff there to go on a ship overseas, and then you bring your money back. And also the barge would usually be broken up into lumber to be sold, because everybody was buying lumber back then too. With this, you no longer had to rely on the current. For one, you could send stuff downriver much more quickly because you had a powered boat. But also, you could send stuff upriver, which again was like basically impossible. You could walk beside the river, but that took forever. So yeah, this was a huge deal. It had a major impact on shipping. So here's the growth of cities between 1820 and 1860. So you can see, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, etc. We had Charleston, and that was about it. Well, New Orleans too, but that kind of doesn't count. And then over here, we still have Charleston. New Orleans is a little bit bigger. Montgomery, Alabama exists because of an iron ore seam they found. But up here, it's just exploded. And particularly this area here, where populations just went crazy. Because these are all the seaports. This is where everybody's coming in, and most people just stick around. Oh, also when I talk about roads, I don't mean like paved roads. I'm talking about gravel roads. But also when I say gravel roads, I don't mean like a gravel driveway like we might see today, where you just have a driveway and you dump a bunch of gravel in it. There was a lot to this. You would even the land out first. You'd even dig these ditches to the side. You'd first put out these large pieces of broken stone, which is what these guys are doing there. They're breaking up larger pieces of stone into these chunks. That'd be the bottom layer, and then the top layer would be the gravel you think of today, where it's the smaller bits of gravel. And the reason for that was when it rained, the rain would filter through the smaller pieces of gravel down to the larger pieces, and then that would funnel, because the middle here is actually slightly higher than the sides, that would funnel the rain to the sides into these little ditches. So it was made to not flood, unless, of course, you just had a massive rainstorm, in which case you're out of luck. But there was some level of like technology behind these gravel roads. It wasn't just, again, they just dumped gravel and called it a day. But excuse me. But before, you just had this and it rained. Congratulations, you've got, mud, and you're not going to be getting very far in that. So this was pretty much the highest level of road technology we had. This is the National Road / the Cumberland Road. It's weird that you have, what was actually built and then what was proposed but not constructed, and it's the same, solid line. So I don't know what that means. If, Cumberland to Baltimore maybe wasn't built, because it talks about it being the Cumberland Road. So I don't know. Anyway, it goes from Maryland all the way over to Illinois and whatnot. So, yeah, pretty substantial. And it was mostly this. There's the Claremont. Again, pretty simplistic. You had a steam engine on it, and it turned these water wheels, and they pulled the ship along. You still had sails for when the wind was favorable, and you just didn't want to use the engine because you only had so much coal. All right. Speaking of technology, whoa now. So with the growth of technology, we're not quite at the Industrial Revolution yet. Well, Britain was, but we're catching up. So there's this multiplier effect, basically where these inventions would come out, and rather than you have an invention and it's used for a specific thing. With this, the invention comes out and it's immediately used for multiple different parts of industry and agriculture and just society in general. And then it's modified to be more effective for different stuff. So you have like a single core technology that affects so many different things because people are able to change it and modify it for what they want. The steam engine is a great example because, like I said, at the start, it was just used to pump water out of mines, but then it's used to run steamboats, trains. It powered basically everything, factories and any kind of electricity they were doing back then, which that was right at the end. They were kind of finishing with steam power by the time we had electricity. But anything that was powered was steam powered. So we have Samuel Slater. He was born in England. He was actually he was meant to take over a textile mill in England, but he decided he could make more money if he came over here and started his own mill franchise. Because we didn't really have textile mills here. We didn't really have the technology for that. Now, I should mention that there was a whole thing about Englishmen could not immigrate over here for the reason of what he was doing. So he had to lie and say that he was coming here to be a farmer. And also, he couldn't bring any of the machines with him to, show the Americans how to build it. He had to just memorize it and rebuild it when he got here. So it was still kind of technically corporate espionage, but whatever. He made money off of it. So he made his way here to America, worked with the Rhode Island merchant Moses Brown. The machine that he copied was made by Richard Arkwright, which again is like the most recent in a series of spinning machines that were being invented throughout the course of the early Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, we have Eli Whitney with the cotton gin. This was specifically meant to separate seeds from the short staple cotton, which grew more readily in the lower parts of the southern states. But if you've ever gotten your hands on raw cotton, excuse me, the seeds are a pain in the ass to get to. Because for one, you're pulling apart like cotton fiber, and that stuff's tough. But the seeds are like down in the bottom, and it's not like a single piece. It's a bunch of little seeds, but they're really hard. And to get the seeds out of cotton, it was a time-consuming process, and it would ruin your hands. Like, it would genuinely you would get arthritis within just like a few years of doing this. Which, again, slave labor, so they weren't too worried about it, but it also like would shorten the usefulness of their slaves. So this happened when he was staying with Catherine Green in her plantation near Savannah, Georgia. He was a traveling tutor, apparently, and was just hanging out there. And she was complaining about how, well, this certain type of cotton, it grows really well around here, but there's the issue with the seeds. So he created what's essentially these metal brushes that like fold together and then push back out, and it would be able to, pull the seeds from the fiber. It took him a couple of days to get it just right, but he did. He got it figured out and immediately applied for a patent. However, because it was such a simple design, once people saw what it was, they were able to make it themselves, and he saw but very little money off of it because people just pirated his design. We also have the American System of Manufacture. This was specifically using machines to mass produce interchangeable parts. Initially, it was to make rifles for the U.S. government. So the idea behind this is before this, when you made guns, specifically again, well, really any kind of guns, they were all handmade. Every gun was completely unique from every other gun. Sure, they all did the same thing. You put gunpowder in and you light it and it shoots, a piece of metal in hopefully that direction. But if, say, the lock on it broke, or the part that lights it broke, or whatever, if a piece of it broke, you couldn't just go, oh, well, let me get another piece from the gun store and just replace it. No, it wouldn't fit. And if you've got a piece on a gun that doesn't fit, it's going to explode in your face. So you just had to throw the whole thing away. And guns were really freaking expensive because, again, they were artisan tools. They were handmade one at a time. So what this would do is it used machining tables, if you've ever seen those, where you like lock the thing in place and it mills out a piece of metal to a certain specification. I've got pictures of it just a minute in case you don't know what I'm talking about. So that if a piece on the gun did break, you could just swap it out with another one. You wouldn't have to buy a whole new rifle. And especially for mass producing it for the federal government, that was pretty important. Because you don't want to have to throw away, hundreds and hundreds of federal guns just because a piece broke. Now again, this was using plans from Henri Blanc, who was a French mechanic, because none of this is wholly unique. Also, by the way, this was another Eli Whitney idea. He operated a factory in New Haven, Connecticut, to try to make money that he didn't make with the cotton gin. Now, the idea of using machines to create standardized parts so that if the product or a piece of the product broke, you could just swap it out with another piece and not have to throw the whole damn thing away. That idea quickly spread to lots of other parts of the industry. Again, guns was the first one, but shoes and probably wagon making, just anything that would benefit from having standardized parts that you could just swap out rather than having to get a whole new one. It should be said, though, that Eli Whitney's original plan didn't work. It's not that the idea didn't work. It did eventually, but he had promised, let's see. Yeah. He had a contract to produce 4,000 rifles in 18 months. he claimed he could devise a machine to manufacture guns in large quantities. By January of 1801, he had produced only 500 rifles, which was not the 4,000 he had promised. So his initial plan didn't work, but the idea stuck around and became eventually like the assembly line, essentially, or at least a part of that. So here's Slater's mills, just rows and rows of machines. Now this is a little bit later because it's being powered by steam engines. We'll get to that more in just a minute as well. Here is the original little handheld version of the cotton gin, where you just put the cotton in there and you turn the thing, and it uses these little metal teeth to separate the seeds from the actual fiber, which was good in that it meant that the people didn't have to freaking ruin their hands getting the seed out of the cotton. However, as we're going to see, I want to say in the very next, no, not in the very next one, but real soon, it means that this cotton can be processed much more quickly and much more cheaply, and considering how fast and readily short staple cotton would grow, it rapidly increased the production of cotton in America, which meant that slavery also expanded to a significant degree, which I'll get more to in a couple of slides. So, yeah. Here's those machines I was talking about. When I say machines, I mean like machining tools, where you lock the metal piece in place and then you run the what's it called? Lathe. It's like a lathe, and it cuts the piece in just the right shape. It's going to be much more precise than like an artisan, working at it with their bare hands. So these inventions, well, not that Samuel Slater invented anything, he just stole it from Britain, but whatever. But the thing about the Industrial Revolution is that it wasn't this like sudden stark change. I mean, it seemed like it to a degree, but these inventions started small and then were gradually improved as time went on. As the book mentions, it was an evolutionary process, gradual change over time, as opposed to suddenly we have trains out of nowhere. That's not how it worked. It took lots of time, lots of iteration on, especially again with the steam engines, to be able to use them in such a capacity, because again, initially they were extremely inefficient, extremely low powered. No way in hell you could get them to like actually have enough power to move something without just exploding. So we had Francis Cabot Lowell invented the power loom, with the weaving mills becoming larger and larger. This was basically a loom that had enough, that was sturdy enough to handle being attached to either a water wheel or, again, a steam engine, which was that belt I showed you guys. I'll bring up a picture here in just a minute to give you guys a better example of what I'm talking about. Jethro Wood perfected a cast iron plow so that Western farmers could produce more for the cities. Again, plows before this point were wooden. If you were a farmer, you just carved a plow out of wood and used it till it rotted away. But with the cities growing, they needed more food, and the only way to plow enough land to grow enough food was to have more efficient plows, and well, cast iron was the way to go. And as we'll see a little bit later on, well, again, like I think it's next semester, it goes from cast iron to steel because the sod in the Midwest was sticking to the cast iron. We also had domestic manufacturing, which is to say manufacturing at home, and by home I just mean in America as opposed to foreign manufacturing. Due to the Embargo Act, because we weren't importing cloth and whatnot from Britain and France, so we had factories, excuse me, factories increasing production, but also just like ordinary folks, just ordinary housewives increasing production of cloth and linen and whatnot. Idea of companionate marriage, husbands and wives working together in these various domestic enterprises. So this was again kind of I wouldn't say a pushback, but just another example of that whole patriarchal system of everyone's got to have their own specific roles. Not really gelling with reality, because men and women were working together in the same jobs, basically. Now, sure, they might be doing different portions of said jobs, but it wasn't some strict hierarchical thing. It was just the reality of what they were doing. And again, like we've seen before with neighbors working together, sharing tools, skills, labor, etc. So if you were, a farmer that happened to get your hands on a fancy pants iron plow, your neighbors would ask to borrow it, and in exchange they would give you, extra thread that they had made or extra cloth that you wouldn't have to make yourself, that sort of thing. Of course, though, when it came to the southern frontier, there wasn't as much of the technology shifting there. They just had slavery. So many of the households would produce and trade locally. Americans who had access to more money often had access to this growing global economy, and, well, I'll just pull up this last slide. Families were sewing with thread spun by machines in factories across the country. They were working fields with cast iron plows that they themselves could not make because you don't have a forge in your backyard typically, or even had food that was brought from elsewhere by steamboats that normally wouldn't have survived the journey, but steamboats are so much faster they could get the fresh food to you before it's gone bad, and you could then have food from different parts of the country that you wouldn't have normally. So we're becoming much more interconnected thanks to these technologies. So here we go. This is the power loom. Specifically, I always call them crankshafts, like in a car where you've got the piston that's turning, or not piston, the bar that's turning here, and it moves these belts which actually power the machines because they make the machines turn. That's what powers the machines. And these are all connected to a steam engine, typically in a specific room in the building so that they're not filling the building with clay or coal clay with coal dust. And as you can see, it goes all the way down. And also there was no kind of protection, like there was nothing covering these belts. So if you got your arm caught in that belt, well, I guess you don't work there anymore because we need people with two arms. In case you didn't know what a plow looked like, I feel like most of us probably do, but just FYI, there's your cast iron plow. Okay, this is what I was talking about earlier. With technological change, it largely affected agriculture when it came to the South, and that was, of course, mostly the cotton gin. Um, as I said, short staple cotton was really easy to grow. The only reason it wasn't the cotton before this point was because of how long it took to actually process due to the seeds. But with the cotton gin, you could just throw them in this thing, turn this crank, bam, you've got cotton that doesn't have seeds in it anymore. It was almost too easy. However, because that part was now easy, they just started growing cotton everywhere, all across the southern states and then into the lower Mississippi Valley. However, they needed people to work the fields because, the farmer sure as hell aren't going to do that. So slavery spread rapidly throughout these regions. Now, it's not to say that cotton was the only thing grown in the southern states. Granted, by the time we get to the Civil War, it is 2/3 of the entire country's economy, North and South, because while of course the South is growing it, the North are the ones that are doing most of the shipping and trading worldwide. So it's most of the economy. But for example, in Louisiana, sugar was their biggest crop. Here in South Carolina, we mostly had rice because of all our swampy, gross lowlands. It's really, really good for rice. So it wasn't just cotton. It was just mostly cotton. So to give you guys an example of how ridiculously fast this stuff grew, 1790, just before the cotton gin was introduced, 3,000 bales of cotton, which weighed about 300 pounds apiece, were produced and, distributed, shipped, whatever. Within 30 years after the cotton gin, we had produced 330,000 bales of cotton. I can't say bales of cotton. That doesn't make sense to my brain. Bales of cotton. That's an increase of, really simple math, 110 times. That is crazy increase in production because of the cotton gin, because they were able to just go from the raw cotton to cotton that could actually be used so quickly. And again, since it grew so easily, they just switched to basically that kind of cotton. Not universally, but almost universally. Again, you can't just say, well, everything was this way, because it wasn't, but this was definitely the majority. Of course, with this increased cotton production, it also paralleled the increased slave population. So, for example, in 1790, there were about 700,000 slaves in the U.S. By 1820, it had risen to about 1.5 million. So that's a little more than doubling over the course of 30 years. Which is interesting because in 1808, the international slave trade ended. I've been alluding to this and just straight up saying this multiple times up to this point. Britain still controlled the ocean. And when they said no more slave trade, there was no more slave trade. They decided that they weren't going to let ships go across the ocean anymore carrying slaves, and everybody just kind of had to listen. So there were no more slaves being brought over from Africa. There was no more, well, I should just say, there's no more people being kidnapped from Africa and brought over as slaves. So when it came to growing the slave population, it had to be done naturally. It had to be, well, as one would say, done the old-fashioned way. You had to let the slaves reproduce. Which meant that in some small degree, the lives of the slaves somewhat improved. because the slave owners couldn't just like work them to death or murder them over some small slight. Um, because now they couldn't just go to some slave auction and buy new ones. Um, they had to treat them well enough that they would be healthy enough to have kids, essentially. Now, granted, it was still slavery, and they were still treated horrendously, um, but they were treated a little better. Which, as I said before, this was never like Brazil or the Caribbean where they were literally worked to death. Um, there were certainly plantations that did that, but that wasn't the norm. And at this point, it was like, yeah, we can't do that at all anymore. There was a, I think we got bump into that next semester. But basically, like during this period of antebellum slavery, um, there's this idea that slaves are seen as a valuable investment, so you don't want to just like murder them or injure them unnecessarily. So again, they're treated slightly better, but it's more for economic reasons than any sort of humanitarian reasons. Though it should also be noted that a lot of slaves in the South had established their own religious ceremonies, oftentimes being influenced by the evangelicals in the area, because, well, the vigor of evangelical worship was quite similar to their own more ancestral practices from Africa, the Caribbean, etc. So a lot of times they would merge these into entirely new religious ideas. Again, the best example of that is just like Louisiana. The Creole culture in Louisiana is this mix of, um, African American slave culture along with just pure African culture, Caribbean culture, and even some French culture because it's Louisiana. It's a unique thing, Creole. So we have the cotton production exploding with the advent of the cotton gin, and then growing year after year. And here, with the increase in cotton production, there was an increase in slavery. So you can see that pretty similar spike. After 1800, it starts going up, increasing pretty steadily. And I do have this map, which, for some reason, I've been able to remember. There was a four-map version of this, and it was quite interesting. So you've got, it shows this whole region obviously, and where there were areas with the spread of cotton, obviously increased slave spread. But in particular, I want to look at this region of Alabama, this little U here, which is one of the darker regions of the spread of slavery. There were more slaves there because it was such a rich region for growing cotton. So, like I said, there were two other maps for this. There was one that was like prehistoric map that showed the inland sea here in North America from like millions of years ago that ended right here. This was a shore. So a lot of the sediment and silt built up here and created really rich soil, which is why this was such a good place to grow stuff, which is why this became a place to grow really good cotton, which is why it led to such an increase in slavery here because of the economics of the day. And the other map for this, it shows this is where the majority of slaves were in Alabama. And then it showed a more modern map of the voting habits of Alabama. And Alabama is, of course, mostly red, except for this little U shape here, because that's where there's, at least population-wise, majority African Americans, because that's where their ancestors were, and that's where a lot of them still live, and it's not so red there. So it's interesting that you can literally look back to like an ancient sea map, and it can affect things literally up until the modern day. So yeah, that's it for that chapter. I'll be managed to finish it with time to spare so I can get on to the next chapter. Yeah, so with all this expansion, scientific and technological advances, some people were able to take advantage of this. People heading to the frontier, searching for land, resources, trade, etc. Whoa, now what the hell was that? Sometimes I wonder if this computer is trying to conspire against me. Of course, for women, if they were in higher classes, they had some access to education, whereas everybody else were pretty much out of luck. With the expansion of cotton, it of course led to the further expansion for slave labor. And for Native Americans, they just lost on every front. Expansion of land meant they were forced further west, facing conflict with the Americans and also Native tribes that were already there. Yeah, it was not good. Needless to say, though, like, very few times in American history can we say, and the Native Americans actually did pretty okay. Because, well, imperialism. All right. Let's move on to, see which one's which. This one. All right. And I want to try to finish this one on Monday. So this chapter gets into the War of 1812. And that's what's going to be our, like, end cap point for the final. So, 1809-1832, defending and redefining the nation. Ugh. So we had the Non-Intercourse Act, 1809, because Britain and France, again, were still at war. This was like the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, and both sides were interfering with our shipping. So a later bill opened trade, but would close trade with whatever side. I wish they just made it easier, where they kept trade closed, but then whichever side would lift their trade restrictions, we'd open trade with them. That's basically how it ended up anyway. Whichever side would drop trade restrictions, we would trade with them and then close trade with the other side. Obviously, France was going to play nice first because they're France compared to Britain, and they're going to do anything to spite Britain. And Britain's not going to play nice with us because they're Britain. So yeah, that's what ends up happening, is we keep trade restrictions on Britain, and we're trading with France. Cool, great. That's what's going on at this point. There's a bunch of other stuff going on, though. So the president's busy. Northwest Territory, General Mad Anthony Wayne crushed the multi-tribe coalition led by the Shawnees at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. We've mentioned this before with Little Turtle, I believe. So the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa, I think, and his half-brother Tecumseh. Tecumseh is a little more important in the broader scheme of things, so remember him. They created a large pan-native alliance in the Ohio River Valley. Luckily for Americans, the Creek and Choctaw natives did not join, but the alliance was still big enough to cause some issues. They built Prophet Town along the Tippecanoe River. William Henry Harrison went in, got a bunch of the native leaders drunk, and had them sign over 3 million acres of land for $7,600, which is basically just stealing land. You know, you get people drunk and have them sign a piece of paper just basically giving you their stuff. Needless to say, Tecumseh didn't like this, and was enraged in the way Harrison took advantage of the natives, because this was, again, a very common thing where these territorial governors would bring in native leaders, get them pissed drunk, and then have them sign whatever papers they want them to sign. And again, when you're so drunk you can barely sit up, you don't know what you're signing. So Madison had Harrison attack Prophet Town, which he did with much gusto, burned the town down. However, Tenskwatawa, as well as Tecumseh, escaped and fled to Canada while skirmishing with U.S. troops the whole way up, and they would be back. So keep that in mind. Tecumseh's still around. They're just up in Canada, which is, recall, British territory. I don't know what this is about. Showing Thomas Jefferson being robbed by the British and French. Look, Napoleon wasn't that short. He was maybe a little below average, but like the average back then was like 5'4" anyway. So like the dude wasn't he would be 4 foot here if he was that small compared to Jefferson. Jefferson wasn't like 8 foot tall. Jefferson was the average size of a man back then, which again was like maybe 5.5 feet. And yeah, so we're really shitting on Napoleon in this picture for some reason, despite the fact that we were getting along with the French more so than the English. But whatever. Battle of Fallen Timbers. Oh, a Federalist must have made this. We'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, Battle of Fallen Timbers. Prophet Town, which is apparently like a national park now. And then the Battle of Prophet Town. And then war. We're fighting Britain. So there are issues with intervention in the frontier, which is to say, the British were very much encouraging the natives to continue hostilities against the U.S. And I think maybe even arming them, because the British liked just to cause trouble. There was also interference with transatlantic trade, which is a nice way of saying they were still grabbing our ships and freaking just like putting our... They were doing impressments still, even though we have been a country for several decades by this point. But they're still just like grabbing our ships and impressing our sailors into service. Which again would be like war level crimes. Not war crimes, but crimes to initiate a war. However, merchants in the Northeast, which is to say Federalists, didn't want war with England because they felt like it would cause just commercial disruption, which isn't untrue because, again, Britain was like the main economic power in the world at the time. Still, though, June 1st, 1812, Madison sent a secret message to Congress, declare war on Britain. They took a couple of weeks to deliberate it, but then they did, so we declared war on Britain in 1812. This was the War of 1812, if you can tell by the year that it's happening. So even though Britain had been at war with France in Europe for, well, I mean, technically, what year is this? 1812? 800 years? On and off. At least with Napoleon for the last decade, their navy was still significantly bigger than ours. This would be like, I don't know, Australia picking a fight with America and be like, oh, let's have a navy fight. It's like, you guys have a navy? Oh, yeah, I guess you do have a navy. You are, bordered on all sides by ocean. Okay, cool. And, like, one of our fleets is bigger than their entire navy? Yeah, that's how we were compared to Britain. We didn't stand a chance. Also, one of the reasons we went to war with Britain is we were wanting to capture Canada. We're like, we'll just take Canada. It's right there. There's nobody there defending Canada. There was more troops in Canada than we realized. And also, they had a ton of native allies because we kept running natives out of the U.S., and they just kept going north to Canada and biding their time, including Tecumseh. I told you guys he'd be back. Very next slide. He's here again. In fact, Tecumseh was appointed to the rank of Brigadier General and was there to help the British capture Detroit. I should mention that Brigadier General is the exact rank that George Washington held. So this wasn't, oh yeah, here's our native ally that we're just going to, give him a gold star and say he can lead some people. He was the same rank as Washington when Washington was in the Revolutionary War. This dude was leading armies against the U.S. We had made an enemy. And, well, he captured Detroit, which, I guess back then was a big deal. Madison managed to win re-election in 1812, despite the fact that the war was not super popular. New England and New York were not on board with this, but he still managed to win. Now, the U.S. did have some victories in the war. Victories on the Great Lakes, which, again, just feels weird. There were major naval battles on the Great Lakes, which, if you haven't seen the Great Lakes before, it's not like a lake like we have around here. They're huge. They have their own weather patterns. So it's more like small inland seas. But still, it's just weird to think of naval battles on freshwater lakes. Tecumseh was killed at the Battle of the Thames, and York, which is modern-day Toronto, was burned. So we started actually hitting back. We were doing okay. So the Federalists had a meeting in New England called the Hartford Convention, which was basically, hey, we didn't consent to this war. We voted against it, but they went to war anyway, which is to say the majority of, Congress agreed to it, and our guys didn't, but that's just what happens. And they were basically pushing for what was essentially, they were pushing for secession. Like, New England was pushing for secession from America over this war because they didn't want to fight the British. They felt like that wasn't they felt like that wasn't for the good of the country to fight the British. However, around the same time, the British landed in the U.S. and burned down Washington City. Oops. So you had these guys talking about how, oh, well, Britain's not that bad. We don't need to fight a war with them. We should just secede and not be a part of this. And then the British land in our capital and burn it down. So, by the way, what we currently have in D.C. is all post 1814 because everything that was built before then got burned down. While this was happening, further south in the country, Andrew Jackson led the militia and Cherokee allies to crush Creek warriors, because again, the Cherokee and the Creek have been enemies since before we ever got here. Then made his way down to New Orleans and pushed the British out by January of 1815, which was like this big, major victory. That's like one of his, considered one of his greatest achievements. Unless, you're one of the people that counts his expulsion of natives as a great achievement, which there are people that do, which is, a thing. However, I really like this achievement because he pushed the British out by January of 1815, but the war was over by Christmas of 1814. This big battle took place after the war was over. Now, granted, I will always give Andrew Jackson crap, because he deserves it. But there is no way a treaty in Ghent, which is Brussels, I think, could have made its way back from Europe between Christmas Eve and like early January. So it's not his fault that he didn't know the war was over, but it's still really funny. That like his big thing is like, oh, he defeated the British at New Orleans. Like, yeah, after the war. Like, this wasn't some victory that definitely made it so we won the war. Like, the war was already decided. This was just a battle that was still happening, that they didn't know the war was over yet. It'd be like if General MacArthur was fighting some war in the Pacific on like this tiny island and defeated the Japanese after we'd already dropped the atomic bombs and they had surrendered. It's like, oh, General MacArthur's this great hero. It's like, this battle meant nothing. The war was over. He just didn't know about it yet. Anyway, so here is Andrew Jackson being all dramatic. Here is Washington City being burned down. Again, also very dramatic. And then Andrew Jackson at New Orleans, I suppose. All right. Let's push a little further on so that hopefully we can get this through on Monday so that I don't have to change my test too much. Right. So as we've said multiple times, Democratic Republicans were against expanding federal power, but they were doing that a lot. We've had the American system, not the American system manufacturer. This is a whole different thing. This was put forth by Henry Clay. Combined farmer aid and federal tariffs to protect U.S. manufacturing and the National Bank to oversee economic development. This is a whole bunch of economic crap. So again, not something I'm well versed on, but it's a lot of federal involvement in the economy and the people. So it's something that the Democratic Republicans normally wouldn't have agreed to. They didn't even want a national bank at all to begin with. But now this is combining aid to farmers, tariffs to aid manufacturing, and a national bank to keep the economy steady, all in like one system. And then, of course, the federally funded internal improvements, which again is to say canals and roads and stuff, that help to push the expansion westward. And after the War of 1812, once again, veterans from that war were given land between the Illinois and Mississippi rivers and encouraged to head out there and farm that land. 160 acres for fighting in a war, that's not bad. 1811, first steamboat went from the Ohio River down to New Orleans, which again is like this major, what would have been back then a thoroughfare. And this began this major expansion of steamboat traffic, which caused freight prices to plummet because, again, freight prices over land was horrifically expensive. But if you could start moving stuff up and down rivers, which is where most of the cities were located anyway, for a fraction of the time and a fraction of the cost, shipping prices are going to drop. People are going to be able to ship more, which means more shipping is going to happen, which means more stuff's going to move around, which means the economy is going to be more lively, I guess. It's good for everybody, I guess, except for the people that were doing the overland shipping because they're now out of a job. It hurt overland routes. The Cumberland Road, which was federally funded, did help a little bit because obviously there were places that rivers couldn't reach and you did need some overland routes. But you wanted to be by a river. You could get anything if you were near a river. We also had the Santa Fe Trail. It was a trail from Missouri down to Mexico, which apparently had been used by the natives since well before any Europeans ever showed up. This was the Osage natives, and Congress apparently negotiated with them to use it, which is surprising. The book just says they negotiated with the Osage natives to use this trail. There was no like, oh, we went in and murdered them, or we got them drunk and stole their land. It's just, oh, we negotiated with them so we could use it, and that's it. So I guess that was it. I don't know. It became a crucial route for commerce between the United States and Mexico. So that was good, I guess. This is the one I want you guys to remember, because if we had more time, I would show you guys a video on this. The Erie Canal. This was a waterway constructed between the Mohawk River to Buffalo, New York. It was 363 miles long. It took until 1825 to complete. So just to show you the insane difference in land travel and a canal now. Before the canal, to ship a ton of grain from Buffalo to New York City by land, it was $100 and took 20 days. After the canal, it cost $9 and took 6 days. That is a substantial difference, especially back then when $100 was like $5,000 today, more or less. That is crazy. So not only are you getting faster shipping, but you're getting substantially cheaper shipping. This linked Western farmers to the Hudson River. It also turned New York City into what it is today. The Erie Canal is why New York City exists. Because it empties out into the Hudson River, which itself empties out into the Atlantic Ocean right there at where New York City is. And since all that commerce was flowing right there, it all just kind of coalesced in New York City, and so they became this capital of commerce and became what it is today because of the Erie Canal. So it's hard to overstate how important the Erie Canal was for economic development. There were cities that did not exist along the Erie Canal that are today major cities that, because of the Erie Canal, it just exists now. Buffalo, New York didn't exist before the Erie Canal. I think Albany even was like part of the Erie Canal, just growth. Now there were a lot of other projects which grew up around the country. Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Toledo were other commercial manufacturing centers. Some places tried to make canals and bankrupted the entire state because canals are expensive, and if they don't get the kind of commerce that the Erie Canal did, they don't pay themselves back. They don't pay themselves off, and you just blew a bunch of money. So it wasn't always great, but again, at least the Erie Canal was. So I've just got some stuff here. American system. Tariffs are good for the North, not so great for the South. Yada, yada, yada. There is the Orleans, first boat built on Western waters. This is closer to what we're used to seeing when it comes to like old-timey steamboats. The big water wheel on the back. There's the Cumberland Road again. And here's the Erie Canal. So the thing about the Erie Canal, you may notice these like paths along either side. Well, a couple things about canals. Do I have another picture of a canal? Or is that the only one I have of the Erie? That's the only one I have of the Erie Canal. Okay, so the thing about canals is they often go uphill, and the only way you can accomplish that is through these locks. So you bring the boat in, you sit in here, and then you either, well, as you can see, this area is lower than this. So you bring the boat in, you stick it in here, and then you raise the water in this section here until it's equal with that. So you're basically, from here to here, you're bringing the boat uphill. And that's how canals work. But because other than steamboats, you didn't really have powered boats back then. You didn't have, little relatively small motors. The way to move barges and stuff through here, since there wasn't really much water flow, being a man-made canal, is you would get like donkeys or oxen or whatever on the side, and you just tie them off onto the barge and just pull it along as you went, which was still significantly faster than trying to go over land on roads that would have been, swampy, horrible messes. Just walking alongside the barge or walking alongside the canal would have been much, much faster. So yeah, that's the Erie Canal. It's not really in use as much anymore today because of trains and planes and interstates and whatnot, but major reason we have some of the cities we do today. Anyway, we will continue this on Monday. Hopefully I'll be able to knock it out. And then we'll have Thanksgiving, and then we'll do the review the next week. So I'll see you all Monday.